Hey guys, hello everyone, good to see you all back. So, actually a couple of minutes ago I managed to play a pretty cool game here on Chess. I didn't really had a chance to catch this game on live and to record the whole process, but I did want to make a video analyzing this game, which was played in a blitz time control, for its educational value. I felt like it was a pretty nice strategic game, and I wanted to share it with you guys. So I was playing with the white pieces, and I was facing actually a pretty strong player, a Grandmaster, Rob Cifuentes, from Spain, if I'm not mistaken. So I was playing white. It was e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6. So this is the so-called four knights Sicilian. Black is hoping, if white is not doing anything special, to be able to play bishop b4, put some pressure against the white center. So it's actually pretty important for white to play knight b5 here in order to try to exploit this little weakness on the d6 square. Black played d6 to cover that weakness. And in this position it's actually very important for white to go bishop f4 to attack the pawn on d6. And the only really normal way to protect this pawn would be to play pawn to e5, which is what my opponent played. And the big drawback about this move is the weakening of the d5 square. So actually by direct transposition we have now achieved the so-called Sveshnikov Sicilian, where black's idea is to actually completely surrender the control over that very important central square. But as compensation he's having very active piece play, and later on he hopes to consistently destroy basically any piece that will attempt to land on the d5 square. We would see something like this happening later on. So black played a6. It's very important to drive away the white's knight out of this is active b5 square. Knight to a3. And here the standard move which all the grandmasters plays b5, threatening to go b4 and actually stopping the white knight from regrouping and come back to the game via c4. So it means that this knight on a3 would take at least some time until you would really be able to come back to the game. So my opponent chose to play a little bit of a sideline, which is bishop e6. In itself a very logical and normal move, developing the bishop, but it is enabling white to play knight c4, and now he is just in time to recruit his knight back to the center of the board, which is something that normally takes white quite a lot of time in normal situations in this opening. So he played this little move rook b8 here. So I assume that his idea was that if I ever going to take on f6, I think he's going to play queen takes actually, but that is just my guess. With the idea to sacrifice this pawn on d6 and perhaps get some active play with bishop takes and rook d8. I'm not sure about this though. But if white at any point tries to play the move knight b6 and recruit the knight back to d5, then it would no longer be a tempo against his rook on a8. So it's a little subtle move which I'm not too much familiar with. And because it's a blitz game, so I decided not to spend too much time and to just play knight e3, basically strengthening white's control over the very important d5 and f5 squares. This knight is now ready to jump on d5. He played bishop e7 to unpin himself, very logical. And at this point I took on f6 and placed my c knight on d5. It's very important to move with the c knight and not the e knight to d5, because when I'm playing this move I'm also enabling this pawn to move forward, and this pawn on c3 is going to be very important in covering those two important central squares, basically denying them from the black knight. So it means that he wouldn't be able never to come to the center of the board. So white has now the strategically nice square on d5, but as compensation black has the 2 bishops, and it's going to be pretty much difficult for white to maintain his knight on d5, because in a later stage many times the black players try to go knight e7 and pretty much consistently destroy any white's piece landing on d5. And as a means of counterplay, black potentially can in the future prepare this pawn break with f5, which is precisely what my opponent tried to do. So bishop g5 was played, c3, once again to cover this d4 square, castles, and I decided to develop my light square bishop at this point. I could have gone bishop c4, but then I was afraid to get hit by the pawn to b5, so I decided to play the slightly more modest move, bishop to e2. And now black plays g6. So he's slowly preparing his counterplay in the center using the move f5. But this is the type of move which is always a little bit double-edged, because on one hand it creates a lot of tension in the center and he wants to eliminate my strong pawn on e4 and get some pawn majority in the center. But on the other hand, it is pretty much severely weakening his king position. So black always needs to be pretty careful when playing such moves. So I cannot really do too much to stop f5, so I decided just to castle and continue my normal development. And he played f5 very quickly. And at this point I understood that I have to do something, because otherwise the black pawns might slowly overrun my position by slowly advancing. So I took an action here and basically captured an f5. Black recaptured with the pawn, so you can see that black has a very powerful looking pawn center. But still, this knight on d5 is very solid, and as long as white manages to keep a solid position on d5, it's going to be not so easy for black to develop his counterplay. But first of all, white must at all costs stop these pawns from advancing, because if black manages to play f4, my knight from e3 would be forced to move and I would lose control over my d5 square. So in my opinion, f4 is a pretty logical move, pretty important. If now black decides to take this pawn, my knight on d5 would be able to recapture while attacking the bishop on e6. And this pretty much cripples black's pawn structure. You see that now all of these 3 pawns are pretty much weak, and in the long term they are going to be very serious weaknesses. This is why my opponent chose to keep the tension, play bishop h6. Now it would be a huge mistake for me to capture on e5 at any point, because then I'm kind of liberating his pawns to regain their mobility. Now both of these pawns can move forward and to create a lot of troubles for me. So at all costs I must keep my pawn on f4. It's a very interesting position. So this is starting from this point, the battle takes a very interesting kind of strategic turn. And at this point I've decided that I want to exchange some pieces, and more specifically the light squared bishops. I felt that if white manages to exchange these bishops, it will increase his control over the d5 square, and it would deprive black's 2 bishops. So bishop c4 was played. You see that this move is also x-raying not only his bishop but also his king. So black must be careful about all kinds of tactical opportunities. That's why he immediately played the move king to h8. And I just decided to play queen to d3, which I think it's a nice little move, connecting the rooks and also protecting all of these pieces in the center, which are a little bit hanging. It's also a little bit of provocation, because now black can play e4 with a tempo against my queen, but once my queen moves somewhere, let's say d2, black loses all of his flexibility in the center. And now you can see that his central pawns are completely blockaded. It means that he can never move forward, and my knights are actually doing a very good job of safeguarding white's position. And here at this point, black played a move which looks logical. I thought it was a little bit of a mistake. He played knight to e7, once again trying to fight against my knight on d5. But this enabled me to reach the type of position that I wanted to get. I wanted to exchange the knights, then exchange the bishops, and now I'm able to play the move knight to d5 without any of his minor pieces. Well, he only left with the dark square bishop, being able to fight against my strong knight on d5. So basically it means that at this point my knight on d5 is a dominant piece, and you see that this dark square bishop is not having too much of future or targets to attack on the white's camp. So I liked my position at this point. I felt that white has a safe advantage. His king is also a little bit weak in the long run. He decided to play pawn to b5, perhaps thinking about creating some counterplay on the queen side of the board. Fairly logical move. It gave me some time though to consolidate my position. I now played rook to e1, connecting my rooks in the center. You can see that these two rooks are creating some nice pressure on his position. And now finally he played this move e4, which he was trying to basically to avoid for very long. But now, since there is so much tension in the center, he decided that maybe it's the right time to relieve the tension. I was kind of happy to see this move because now his pawns are very safely blockaded. So I played queen d4 check, just to kind of force him to go bishop to g7, and only then move my queen back. And I was not sure about this, but I was claiming that his bishop was less well placed on g7 because it's blocking potentially this g file, which could generate quite unpleasant counterplay for black. So he now played pawn to a5, continuing the same plans of pushing the pawns on the queen side. I played a3 just to stop it. So the next moves are going to be basically both sides trying to improve their positions very slowly and to prepare for the coming complications in the future. I still believe that the white's position is slightly better here because once again this nicely centralized knight on d5, and the other thing is the king's position. The black king is always a little bit weaker because he's not having this g pawn to protect him, while my king still has all of his defensive pawns in front of him, so he should be pretty safe. So black played rook f7. It's a nice move. The rook is pretty flexible on f7. It can go to the queen side at some point. It can also keep itself in the center. I played the pawn to g3, which is a nice move, keeping all of white's pawns protected in one chain, and also giving my king a light square to stand on g2. Because in general I don't want my king to stand on a dark square since he has the dark square bishop. It would be nice to place the king on g2. He now played the move rook to c8. So conceptually a very important moment. He wants to play now rook to c5 and to force my knight away from its very active square on d5. So I understood I have to defend this knight properly. My first instinct was to play rook to d1, but I did not like the fact that this pawn on e4 is being liberated to move forward. So what I have decided to do is to play the move rook to e2, and after rook c5 to move the other rook to d1. And now this rook on e2 is still keeping an eye on the square on e3, so he cannot really advance. So I kind of like this little regrouping there. And at this point I felt like my opponent, a very experienced grandmaster, perhaps lost his patience a little bit, because his position is a little bit passive, but perhaps if black plays very solid defensive moves, he should be able to hold his position in the long run, even though it's a little bit unpleasant. He decided to go for very aggressive counterplay on the king's side. He started pushing his h-pawn, h5. I have to say I was fairly happy to see this move, because this move further weakens his king position. And you would see that later on white would actually will be able to exploit this fairly substantial weakening of his king side position. So I played king g2, my planned move in advance to put my king on the light square. And this move also has a little bit of a hidden point to eventually be able to move my rook to h1. And this could be very relevant once black plays his planned move pawn to h4. The h file is very much likely to be opened up at some point. Then it would be nice for me to be able to move my rook to h1. So I didn't really want to take his pawn on h4 and to open up my king position, so I decided to play this solid move knight to e3, attacking the pawn on d6 using this battery of the queen on the rook on d1. So he now took on g3 and played bishop f8 to protect the pawn on d6. And now actually it's very much paradoxical that the opening of the h file was absolutely in white's favor. I'm actually the one who will be probably the first to leave to put a rook on h1. So I gave a little check on d4, which is a nice subtle move, I think, because now after he cannot play bishop g7 back because the pawn would be hanging. So he played king g8, now rook h1, threatening checkmate on h8, and he pretty much has to play rook h7 to diffuse my activity on the h file. But now after the exchange of rooks, you would see that his king, once again, is much more exposed than my king. The king on g2 has two defending pawns, while the black king has literally 0 pawns protecting him at the moment. And now came a pretty critical point. I understood that white's potential here lies in his chances to attack. But my next move I kind of liked. I also checked after the game. It was, if I'm not mistaken, the engine's first move. It's a very paradoxical move. Queen to d1. It's a move which is very difficult to make because it seems like the queen is very well placed on d4. But actually from d1 it has much more potential. It can come later on to h5 to check the opponent. It can also come via h1. Another important thing is that it gives the rook on e2 a square to move to on d2 to put some pressure against the pawn on d6, but with the rook being in front, which is much better than having the queen in front, because the rook always likes to be the piece which eventually takes the pawn on d6 and not the queen, which is more valuable. And now he made a fairly critical mistake. He played bishop to g7. We have to also remember that this is a blitz game. Rook to d2, attacking the pawn on d6. I feel like he forgot about this move because now he had to go back to f8 since the move rook c6 loses the pawn on h5 after check, and this pawn falls on the next move. So bishop to f8 was played. Queen to h5 check. And now white's attack is starting. And as you know, a queen together with the knight in the attack is a pretty dangerous combination. He played queen to h6. I checked on f7. I do not want to exchange queens because I'm on the attacking side here. And black had a lot of troubles here. So he played queen to g7. Once again, I have no intention of exchanging queens. So I played queen to e6. Queen to g6. There's a little queen dance here. Black tries to exchange the queens, white is trying to decline it. But eventually, after some moves, partially I wanted to make some quick moves just to gain some time on the clock, because at this point I already had only 4 seconds left. But it was just enough time for me to execute my final attack. Because after the move bishop e7, now we need to ask ourselves how to improve white's attack, and we know that what we need to do is to develop to bring all of our pieces to the attack. Now which piece on our side is still not helping us in this attack is this rook on d2. So a very critical move now came, rook to d1, with the idea to bring the rook on h1. It's actually almost a checkmate, and it's just impossible to stop. His rook on c5 is completely kind of out of the game. He cannot do too much to contribute to the king's safety. And this is the point where black collapsed. He played queen to f8. I checked on h5. And after the move queen to h6, once again, no queen exchange, queen to f7 check, queen to g7, rook h1 check. Black at this point resigned because actually it's checkmate on the next move. The only legal move that black has is bishop to h4, and after rook takes bishop, it's checkmate. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this game for its educational value. We had some very strategic battle here, a lot of maneuverings, a lot of exchanges, strategic exchanges. We basically managed to beat a fairly experienced Grandmaster. Definitely was a good experience. So once again, hope you enjoyed this one. Hope to see you in the next videos. See you guys. Bye bye.